Special Needs Education in Practice. This is a One School for All lecture by me, Andrew Thomas, at Østfold University of Applied Sciences, which I would like you to watch by Wednesday, the 26th of August, when we will have a lesson. So we learned this week that in 1992, Norway closed all its special schools. So what do schools do today without the ability to divide pupils into regular schools and special schools? What they do is they do what they can. That's the first rule. But if they're still experiencing problems, if the pupil and the teachers think that this child is not benefiting from the education as it is being offered, then they can flag that up, and the school decides that, like I say, the pupil is not benefiting from the educational offer which they're doing at the moment. And then a formal legal decision is made which transfers the pupil from the ordinary educational system into an entirely different legal regime, whilst keeping the pupil in the same school. So the pupil isn't moved away, but there is a definition happening. They are categorized as in need of individually adapted education. Now, let's talk a little bit about individually adapted education. Notice that the pupil is categorized in relation to something that's fixed, namely the education. The school is meant to make changes first of all, but both the school and the consultants are asked to decide whether the pupil benefits from the education satisfactorily. Now, skeptics will say that many of the diagnoses that trigger special needs education or individually adapted education are created by the classroom. The diagnoses are a function of the classroom itself. For example, if you have a classroom practice whereby everybody has to sit still all the time, of course a large number of pupils are going to be dissatisfied with that, and you're going to maybe call those ADHD pupils. That's not natural, the skeptics will say. And I'm not going to touch that debate here and now, but the point is that the observation that is being made by the school and by the scientific consultants which the school brings in is made in reference to historical classrooms which weren't necessarily like this 50 years ago, 100 years ago, but they're like this today. And the experts, their role on the basis of this definition is to explain why the pupil is in this situation. Okay, so, and if they're not benefiting, then they get individually adapted education, whereas adaptive education as such is something that that everybody has a right to. Notice that before this decision is made, the school has to make some kind of adaptations to the pupil. According to the General National Curriculum in Norway, adaptive education is for all pupils. So whatever this division between regular pupils and individual adapted education is, it's not about whether adaptation happens at all. All pupils are adapted to. All education in Norway is adaptive, but some students are defined as in need of individually adapted education. So the universal adaptive education is also based on information about the pupils, just like we have to have some kind of information, some kind of data, some kind of expert definition. And we're going to look later on in the semester at what kind of knowledge you need to have about a classroom, about a set of pupils in order to adapt your education. So everything basically takes data, but the conclusion is different. The data for regular pupils feeds into what kind of adaptations we're going to make, whereas the data about this particular group of pupils decides what special adaptations, what individual adaptations are going to take. And this feels like a teeny tiny difference, right? Now, this difference is made even smaller by the fact that what works in education tends to be the same. I've put this book on the reading list, What Really Works in Inclusive Education. And the answer is going to be something like adaptations work, but what kinds of adaptations work? And as we've already said, adaptations for everybody. But as Mitchell and Sutherland point out, a lot of the research about what kinds of adaptations work tells us that what works in education tends to be the same. And yet at the same time, this book, Mitchell and Sutherland, tends to be used, and it's a recent update of a book that's been around for a while, tends to be used in a different qualification. This tends to be used to qualify special needs education people. And some of you are on courses which qualify you as a special needs educator, and it might be called different things in different countries, but essentially most modern education systems have education degrees and special needs education. So there's different qualifications, and certainly in Norway we've got two different sets of qualifications here. They overlap, but they are two different names. But in addition, the law says that once somebody is awarded or defined as an individually adapted, or pupil that gets individually adapted education, we can give them different content. They may have different subjects, they may have different sections of that subject, they may have more of one thing and less of another. So there's different qualifications, there's different content, there's different system of assessment. Whilst exams are defined very strictly in Norwegian law as to what pupils have a right to when it comes to assessment, we'll come back to assessment later on in the semester. Those laws can be diverged from in the educational provision of pupils who have a right to individually adapted education. And so they have different rights. They have different rights to differently qualified teachers, different content, different assessments. So all of these things are two quite different systems, and yet we said that a lot of the things are actually the same. So it's like two systems based on one set of research, two different kinds of pupils, but so much about those pupils is exactly the same. So the law in Norway describes a robust division between two different kinds of pupils, but the principles of how they are to be treated are the same. It's all based on data about that pupil. We need to know about the pupil in order to know what to do with them. And the principles of how they are to be treated are very similar. What works in those different sets of education is very often very much of the same kind of thing. But the process of how we make the division is extremely heavy work. The school has to flag a need, they have to make a definition, there has to be a scientifically well-grounded description of the issue, it can be explained in a different way, the pupil can be tested by expert consultants, and then once the explanation has been established and consented to, we have to try out lots of different ways of working towards what kind of educational provision they should have, and those different ways, they're very often exactly the same or very similar to the kind of educational provision that what pupils are meant to have. So it's a heavy definition. Why do we do all that work? Well, it feels like we all know why we need this two different systems. It feels like everybody has accepted this definition of special needs education and regular education, or individual adaptation, or just general adaptation. It's perhaps true to say that the reasoning behind why we need special needs education or individual adaptation, or as Mitchell and Sutherland say, learners with additional needs, the reason we have those systems is not best described by looking at legal documents, but it remains, however, a primarily legal definition. Hopefully in our lesson, we will get past the legal niceties and talk about practicalities. I'll see you in class.